Welcome, everybody. My name is Gideon Rose. I'm the editor of Foreign Affairs, and we have a really great, interesting session today. Global risk perception, deception, and delusion. We're going to explore lots of interesting questions about how we can predict things, whether it's possible to get intellectual purchase on what's coming down the pike, and if so, what are the best approaches and what we've learned from some of the chaos that's been happening. We have a great panel. Maria Konnikova, who's a brilliant author and psychologist, a student of Sherlock Holmes and poker and a variety of other approaches. Robert Shiller, the Sterling Professor of Economics at Yale, a Nobel Prize-winning genius, and Victor Chu, the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of First Eastern Investment Group, who's come at these questions with skin in the game in a way that the others have in their own respective things, but brings a new thing to the table. But before we kick into our discussion with the panelists, we're going to get a presentation by Aengus Collins, the head of global risks and geopolitical, and the geopolitical agenda at the WEF, who's going to give us an update on their findings about global risks 2019. Aengus.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. As Gideon said, I lead on global risks here at the Forum, and that entails each year we produce a global risks report. And one element of that report is a survey of 1,000 people drawn from across the Forum's various communities, so private sector, public sector, civil society, and so on. And as a route into the panel's discussion about perceptions and related issues, I just wanted to run through some of the key results from this year's survey. Now, this chart shows one of the things we ask respondents to the surveys. We give them 30 global risks, and we ask them to assess them over a 10-year horizon for likelihood and impact. So we see likelihood on the x-axis, impact on the y-axis. And there's one pattern that I want to highlight here, and it's the relative positions of environmental and economic risks. So that top right-hand corner is effectively, those are the higher impact, higher likelihood risks. Conversely, the bottom left-hand corner is lower impact, lower likelihood. So we have this division between environmental risks perceived as higher impact, higher likelihood, economic risks less so. That's a pattern we've seen harden over the last couple of years. And it's actually, if we take a step back and look at the last 10 years, we see it's actually one of the key trends over the history of the Global Risk Report. What this chart is showing us is the sweep from 2009 through to 2019. And each block shows the top 5 risks by likelihood and by impact. And one of the key developments has been this shift from the blue, which again is the economic, to the green over here. Are there potential external inflection points that may be influencing these perceptions? Possibly. I'm going to leave this to the panel to discuss further. 2012 starts, I think, we see a break in terms of the weight or the presence of economic risks. 2012 was Draghi's whatever it takes speech. I think a sense that the second leg of the global financial crisis, the Eurozone, was, if not over, at least moving out of the really existential phase. 2015, Paris Agreement, again, possibly there's an increase in the prevalence of the environmental risks. Even though that process started earlier, it really has come to dominate in the last few years. And I think, briefly turning from environmental and economic, the purple cells are technological risks, which have actually been interestingly absent for most of the course of the risk report. We seem to have a very technology optimistic sample, which is borne out with other surveys that we've done. But it's interesting in the last few years that those risks have started to pop up. And I don't think it's a coincidence that that's following 2017, which I think we will probably look back at as having been something of a tipping point in terms of cyber attacks with WannaCry, Petya, NotPetya, and so on. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to hand back to Gideon and just leave the panel to discuss these issues of perception, deception, and delusion.
Great. Aengus, thank you very much. There's a fascinating amount of stuff there, and in some ways it sets up this great discussion. I mean, we were all living through those eras, and we all saw the risks and judged those various things ourselves as well. And we can see how much purchase the expert consensus wisdom at Davos got us in terms of accurately predicting what would happen next. Maria, let me start with you. In poker, there's an adage among many serious players, don't play the cards, play the player. And in fact, what you're really doing is engaged in this sort of psychological reading of the other people, and that's why it's not just a gambling exercise, and that's why it can be a skill. And my brother tells me you lose not because you've had bad luck, but because you're a bad poker player, and if you could learn to read the other players better, that would work. Is the way to get advantage not to calculate the numbers, not to look at the odds, which are all public variables that everybody can see, like open cards, but is the way to either get some kind of peek into the other person's cards? Is it cheating that gives you the answer in poker? Or is it learning how to play the players and getting insight, and presumably in terms of risk management, that would be understanding how the other players approach things as well and getting into their psychology. But what tips and advice do you have in terms of reading other players and predicting the future of the game from your various perspectives?
So I think that it's a combination of the two. I don't think that you can be a good poker player without understanding the probabilities, without understanding the risks, and without kind of that objective baseline. And in fact, so my PhD was in psychology, and then in psychology of risk perception. And what you learn from psychology is that humans are actually terrible at probabilities. We're really bad at understanding risks. Even professionals, even people who've spent their entire lives looking at it, are really just plain awful. And it's because our brains learn from experience, and we don't learn very well from description. And poker actually gives you a correct sampling of risk probabilities because you're getting immediate feedback, and you actually have to be taking it into account as you're making your decisions if you want to be a good player. Now, that said, I think that the human element is huge. If you're always playing your cards, you're going to be a losing player. And it is a skill game. I think in the short term, variance definitely plays a huge part. I can sit across from someone who's never played before and they can beat me. And I think that's true of almost any interaction where there's uncertainty. In a stochastic environment, you never really know what's going to happen, even if you make decisions in the best possible way. Over the long term, I think that you do gain an edge because it is a skill game. So over the long term, you are either a winning player or a losing player. And my personal edge actually is psychology. It is understanding how do different people perceive risk? Because I'm going to play very differently against someone who's risk-seeking than against someone who's risk-averse, than against someone who's been risk-averse but all of a sudden has lost a lot of money and suddenly is risk-seeking because now they want to chase their losses. They want to just get it all back. They think just one more hand, and now I'm going to gamble it up. And all of a sudden, they're not thinking rationally. And if you actually think about investing, if you think about financial decision making, there's so many parallels there because people react to gains and to losses very, very differently. That's psychology. There's not kind of one way that everyone reacts to the same situation. And I think the key is to figure out, how does this person see it? How are they reacting to it? And then you react to that. You have to be the one who's willing to adjust. You have to be the one who's smarter and who says, okay, you've lost, and that's actually making you even more risk averse. You're taking all the money out because you think, uh-oh, I'm done. I can't afford to lose anymore. Or have you lost, and now you're saying, no, now I need to really make sure that I win. Whatever it is, it's no longer rational. Poker, I think, is one of the best environments for highlighting how often emotion gets in the way of logical decision making and how often we don't look at risk objectively. We don't actually sit there calculating probabilities, and instead we react.
Okay, that's a perfect lead in to Bob Shiller. Okay, just how much, honestly, has behavioral economics and the extent to which these kinds of questions that Maria was just talking about deflect us from purely rational calculations of risks and odds? How much is all that sort of monkey in the, a wrench in the works that basically means we can't predict things and it's all stochastic whatever, or is it just minor variations on an otherwise rational market that over any legitimate stretch of time and place will come back to some kind of logical fundamental mean?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because it depends on context. So sometimes, well, look at individual stocks. Do their price movements make any sense? Well, to some extent they do. They have a breakthrough in technology or there's some news story about them and they respond. But if you go to the whole stock market, it's different. I think the level of the stock market is mostly psychological because we don't have any way of knowing what to expect from the whole stock market. No, I think this phenomenon that you just reported is a substantially psychology of the moment as part of a game. These experts are playing a career maximization game, and they've learned what to say. If you bring up, what was it, the financial crisis now, talking to reporters, they know it's not going viral. This is not it now. So you naturally go to extreme weather events because you know that, like a good poker player, you get a response. So I don't think that these things are purely, that's why we had deception in the title of this session, I think. These are given by people who they don't know what the big problems are. They're playing, they may view themselves as playing a game, and if you get them over beers afterwards, they may even admit it.
So you played this game in Irrational Exuberance back in the day, where you were saying, okay, I think the market is over, reacting to certain kinds of things, and that there's going to be some. That convinced Alan Greenspan to a certain extent, and the world eventually came around to that view several years later.
Right.
But there was enough of a gap between the irrational exuberance and when the actual sort of crash came that a lot of people in Victor's world sort of, if they had bet everything against, if they had thought that irrational exuberance was the top in '96 or whatever, then they would have missed several more years of big boom. And if people who've been convinced that things were going wrong, does anybody, including Nobel Prize-winning economists, have any better ability to predict the future or foresee events than the game-playing experts trying to do the reputation management? Or do the economists do reputation management as well?
I think they do. I think that's all of us. So economists, incidentally, weather is an important model for economists. They think we should be like weather forecasters. But the problem is that weather is not psychological. I mean, the weather doesn't have emotions. But we have to adopt a different strategy. And the economics profession, I think, has been too focused on rationality. This is something I've been working, many of us, there's a revolution going on in economics now, and it's moving more toward psychology.
And does that fundamentally overturn the previous models, or is it just tweak them on the margins?
The nice thing about economics models is they're always wrong. Because the level of approximation in any economic model is going to be very high. I could give a lecture on some purely rational models, but at the end of our lecture I'd say, this was fun, wasn't it? But don't rely on this model.
That's funny. I had a friend who did modern philosophy, and he kept trying to explain Husserl to me. And it was all about this thing about, well, the car doesn't really exist. You just think it exists. And I'm like, so I can walk out into the street. He said, no, don't walk out into the street. You'll be hit by a car. And I was like, well, wait a second. Your whole thing was about it doesn't really exist. It's all in your mind. And he said, yeah, but don't get that confused with the real world. In some ways, that seems to be what's true of modern economics and not just modern philosophy. But Victor, let me go to you for a second, because you've made a career being a sort of contrarian investor, asserting your ability to predict and backing yourself the way Maria would at the poker table, and actually winning. So what is it that you have been able to do, and how have you been able to predict enough of the future to make successful investments over time in ways that cut through the confusion that everybody else is seeing?
It's getting more and more difficult. Who will expect, as late as 3 years ago, that the number one global risk today is the unpredictability of the Trump administration in terms of policy making, right? And who will predict, even as lately as 2 years ago, the unprecedented global volatility of the market is because China is trying to deleverage, and now it's coming back to hurt them in global growth. And psychologically, people think that the deceleration of the growth in China will impact on the global economy. But actually, that is part and parcel of the Chinese leadership's long-standing policy to reinvent itself from headline GDP growth to more sustainability, sustainable quality growth. So there's a lot of delusion. This is a great contributor as a very good reference, but we have to understand that this survey is based on the Davos elites, so to speak, 1,000 companies of our community, mostly white middle class, mostly from developed economy. Although there's more and more chapters devoted to the developing market and the emerging and the frontier economies, which is great. But this is a very useful tool. But as you say, whether Trump administration is playing a poker game in terms of some of the policy formulation, such as US-China relations, we have to look at whether this is a tactics or strategy. There's a difference between tactics and strategy. Maybe it's a tactics, which he may win, but strategically he may lose down the road. And that's where contrary investor, we have to take a view. Otherwise, we might as well buy everything the machine will tell us. That's where I think we can make a difference, is using our particular judgment experience and trying to formulate a particular winning formula of the day. It may not last, but on the day we may make it.
In your experience, first of all, this is fascinating. In your experience, how long has how much purchase in terms of a time frame of investment does your special insight give you? In other words, at some point you have to obviously have the world that you predict come into fruition, and then you realize the investment because things have done there. What is the time frame? Can you predict a few months, or is it a few years, or is it like some kind of timber thing and decades down the road? What has your experience been in terms of how you can do that? What is the optimal time frame for that contrarian investing?
That's why I said there's a difference between tactics and strategy. As a long-term investor, as a direct investor, you need to work at strategy. As an equity investor, now I was on the board of the stock exchange on the listing committee some years ago, and obviously privy to a lot of privileged information. And I did a study myself. Knowing what I know, if I play the market, does it work? It doesn't. Actually, if you have all the privileged information as a regulator and you play the market, you actually lose money, because the market behaves differently. So I think that's the interesting point. What is the X factor that it behaves differently because of the human psychology part? Yeah, because basically it's the speed of change is now different. Right? Even with the privileged information, the market changes in seconds.
Okay, so I'm going to take, before we get to our panelists and engaging the discussion, I want to take another round of questions on this interesting point about the time frames. Because in many respects, all of you are talking about something that's chaotic in the short term, but more predictable and structured in the longer term. The science fiction writer Isaac Asimov once tried to predict, and he realized that human psychology couldn't really be predicted in the short term, but that he wanted to write some kind of big future that looked better. And so he came up with the Foundation trilogy, and the idea was, oh, you can predict things in the aggregate. Human psychology can't predict it in the short term, but in the aggregate. What you guys almost are suggesting, what did Keynes say? That the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. The point being that at some point it eventually comes back to being rational, and at some point the short-term chaos gets back in sync with the long-term fundamentals. What is the way that happens? Like, so Bob, we were talking about the 90s and the over exuberance. Right? The fact that you were right about markets and where they were going, but a few years off. Is there a difference between being early and being wrong? in timing, Victor, you can make all the right calls, but if you get the time frame wrong over that, chaos, or if you get this, if it's all dependent on who's going to predict what Donald Trump is doing, as you said, it's like playing poker with somebody who's not necessarily a great player, and also you're playing for the first time, and you have no idea about his psychology, and that can be a very difficult person to play, right? So if no one could see these kind of things coming in the last couple of years, how do you relate the short-term chaos to the longer-term stability that one is supposedly predicting or able to bet on in any of your fields?
Well, I think in poker, it's the easiest one to answer, right? Because poker, unlike the stock market, is a circumscribed environment. It is ultimately a game. And so I think that what you need to realize is that you need to have the correct strategy that you know is the winning strategy. And be willing to suffer a lot of short-term losses. But you don't know what the short term is. You don't know if the short term is a month. You don't know if it's a year. You don't know if it's several years. You actually don't know how long your downswing might go, because even if you are correct, let's say 73% of the time, maybe you are in the part of the distribution right now that's the 27%, where you're actually just making the right decisions, but the cards are going against you. And it's very, very easy. It's human nature to then change your strategy and to say, uh-oh, something is wrong. And I think what's very difficult is to figure out, am I actually in the bad part of the distribution, or do I need to question and go back and question my decision-making process? What's going on? And
how do you make that evaluation?
So it's different. In poker, you have data. Right? You have immediate feedback, and there are only so many variables. In the stock market, I think it's much more difficult because human psychology really tries to find the exceptions. People don't like saying, I've been thinking about this wrong all the time. There's so many things that you can point to as to why you personally are an amazing trader, but you happen to lose money this year because you're actually right about everything. But this went against you, and that went against you. And in the real world, you have so many excuses that you can constantly call upon. So instead of clarifying your decision-making process, you say, oh, it's not me. And if everything's going well, you say, oh, it is me. But if you look at some of the data on stock market behaviors, a lot of professional investors I've spoken with will not believe it just because they say, well, this can't actually happen. Like, for instance, studies all over the world that show that stock markets go down on rainy days. I mean, how rational is that? When people are in countries that really are big sports fans, on days of major victories, stock markets tend to go up. When there are major sports losses, stock markets tend to go down. We often make decisions on those types of things, but we think that we're going through a very specific decision-making process. And in poker, you actually have the opportunity to disentangle those things because you do have limited inputs. And so I think that if all investors were also poker players, then they could actually then take that mindset to their professional life. Unfortunately, I think it's much easier said in a theory than in practice.
So Victor, let's go with you on that one. How do you decide when to hold them and when to fold them? When to walk away and when to run, as it were?
I want to make a point. I think in the world of finance, we can play poker. But in the world of public policy, we shouldn't play poker because you're affecting people's lives short, medium, long term. That has to be strategy related rather than poker tactics. I think it will be highly irresponsible for policymakers to play poker. I think that is a message which I feel very strongly. And I really hope that despite the chaotic world we live in, gradually there will be some strategy that will come through, then we have more clarity. And I think we probably, in the next few years, even in the White House, we will have better clarity of what really is the strategic direction.
I certainly hope so. Cicero at one point says he doesn't understand how two soothsayers could pass each other on the streets of Rome and not burst out laughing. The idea being of their ability to predict. Bob, you've been studying all this stuff your entire life. Do you come away from your entire career of looking at human prediction and these of risk management, whether in the markets or in the broader systems like Victor just talked about, do you come away thinking that it's even worth trying to do this prediction? Do we get any intellectual purchase? Are we collectively smarter and able to even are these exercises worth doing at all?
If you're smart. There was a famous paper by Judith Chevalier that compared the investment outcomes with a measure of the intelligence of the investor, and found that smarter investors do better. So there you have it.
So give your fund manager not a returns check, but an IQ test.
Yeah, and you also don't want an autistic manager. You want someone who has social intelligence and can understand what's coming and going. So I think the people here on your survey had those sorts of things in their mind. What is being talked about now? And you were asking me earlier about my predicting the. Well, I had two. One was the stock market. The other was real estate market. Just a little sense of what. It's sort of a tie into this. I do questionnaire surveys of home buyers, and I ask open-ended questions where they would write a short paragraph to answer. I like to do that because I can then later go back and count how many times they mention certain things. So in 2003, 2004, I searched for the term housing bubble. Not there, nowhere, never, zero. And then suddenly it starts to appear in 2005, 2006, and then it goes viral by 2007. So that has to be relevant to what's happening. If you were to, as an expert, bring up housing bubble in 2003, it would just fall totally flat. What is this guy talking about? Not interested. And then what psychologists tell us is that there's something called an affect heuristic. And the kind of things that are brought to our attention actually affect our emotions. And that ultimately affects our behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a related hypothesis called mood as information, where we actually look at how we're feeling and we use it as information to make decisions that are completely unrelated. I think one of the other things you're talking about is also availability heuristics, right? What is the thing that's most available to your mind? That's going to weigh way too much into your decision making. If you're going to overweight it because it's something that's available to you at that particular moment. Danny Kahneman wrote about that, about recency bias. What are the things that are most recent in your mind? What are the experiences that you can recall that affected you emotionally, that are most available to your memory right now? Those are the things that are going to affect how you perceive risk and how you actually end up reacting to risk, and not any sort of list that I might give you of objective probabilities of certain things happening. Like if you were to, in 2003, give me an objective list that said housing bubble, I'd say, what is it? What are you talking about? Even though you could have told me, I'm an economist, I have all of these wonderful theories and people really respect me and you should listen to me. I'd say, yeah, but.
Well, can I ask you, do you think you could make a living playing poker?
Yes, I think that people can make a living playing poker. It is a skill game over the long term. And
haven't the courts ruled that actually?
Well, yeah, I think
they had to.
Yes,
like,
and I think that basically you do need to understand that poker is not gambling. That blackjack is gambling. Things where you can not control the outcome at all. Poker, I think the definition of a skill game is you can win with the worst hand. And you can lose with the best hand. So it means that there's something else going on. It's not just the objective value.
It's funny, I've often felt that in the study of international relations and the geopolitical stuff, the poker is often the best analogy because it's like a stud game, right? In which everybody has some cards that are open and some cards that are private, and your intelligence services are trying to get their private card data, and you're all playing some things in common. It's actually the good poker players are good diplomats and vice versa, too.
Absolutely. Well, in fact, John von Neumann, who invented game theory, game theory came out of poker, and he actually believed that if you could solve poker, you would solve nuclear war, you'd solve all of these global.
Say that?
Yeah, that you could prevent nuclear war by understanding poker, because it's such complex human strategic decision making, because it is a game of incomplete information where you are, it goes back to your opening remarks, where you are playing people just like you are in any negotiation.
As someone who just curated an entire package on the current nuclear situation and what we've learned, many, many years and decades on. It's fascinating to know just how little we actually know about nuclear interactions and nuclear deterrence, because everything ended with the Cold War and sort of went into the history books, and now the study is re-emerging, but we don't actually know any of that stuff. And I'll open it up for discussion with a John von Neumann anecdote. Apparently once he was, it said that he was taking a friend to a place in the country, and the friend sort of saw a horseshoe nailed up over the door, and the friend said, "John von Neumann, one of the world's most rational man, a great mathematician, you have a horseshoe, you believe?" And von Neumann apparently said, oh, you don't understand. That's the great thing about horseshoes. They work even if you don't believe in them. So, okay, we have a wonderful audience here. Why don't you guys engage? We'll come around with a mic. We have, if anybody has predicted all the events of the last few years accurately, please tell us how you've done it, and if not, engage with
And please give me some poker lessons then.
over here.
Nelson Cunningham, McClarty Associates in Washington. It was a great analogy bringing in Isaac Asimov, but you didn't take it far enough. Because if you remember from reading the books, yes, these scientists had predicted algorithms that would predict the future. And then periodically, they would reappear. The holograms would appear to the leaders and say, well, you're having trouble with the outer planets now, and here's what we think you ought to do. They suddenly discover that what the scientists are telling them is deviating from reality, because it turns out there is this political figure named the Mule, who comes out of nowhere and starts dominating galactic politics in a way that the algorithms couldn't predict. So Isaac Asimov actually did a better job of describing what we're doing today than simply setting out the Foundation series. He also gave us the Mule.
Actually, well, let's go in the back there. I'll respond to that one in my final remarks.
Dr. Schiller, you and Chip Case have done wonderful work in the housing area. I think your last prediction in October was there wasn't a housing bubble now. Could you tell us what your views are on housing and interest and why?
Well, for the U.S., where we collect data and make indices, I would say that we have been since 2012 in the third largest housing boom ever. Well, our data began in 1890. So the biggest one ever was 1996 to 2006. That was but there was another one in 1942 to 47. So we're in a rare circumstance, and it's a little bit hard to categorize it. It's been going up pretty fast, but it doesn't seem to me to have the same psychology as we had in the biggest boom. Where does that leave us? We see some cities slowing down. Seattle has been falling. It was the highest, so it looks like maybe the bubble is bursting in Seattle. But I still don't know. You know, as you say, it's somebody is throwing the dice, and I can't say exactly what's happening next in the U.S. housing market or any other housing market.
How much of that will be affected by the political turbulence in D.C.?
Donald Trump has changed the taxation of housing. Actually, he has made it less favorable to housing. You might think that he would make it more, the way he's done for corporations, made it more favorable for corporations. So that has had an impact on the housing market. Also, the uncertainty, what does that do to you? A lot of people buy housing as a strategy to improve their lives and their children by getting connected with the right political group. I can't claim to have figured this all out, where it's going.
Okay. Yes, back over here.
Hi, Brian Schmidt, Australian National University. One of the things one could imagine in 2019 doing is aggregating huge amounts of data about individuals, which people are doing, and then get maybe a better ability to look at group psychology. But then we do have the acts of individuals, Donald Trump being an example, where you're not going to particularly be able to use that. So what do you think the opportunities are to augment that big information than with the information that you would use typically as a poker player or as an investor.
This goes literally to the exact, the Isaac Asimov question, which is basically, is social psychology more predictable than individual psychology, especially as you get more aggregate data? And will the new data gathering techniques and the new big data information and processing techniques give us the ability to process and to monitor and process social interactions in the same way that we can, and learn from them in the way we can do that? That's an interesting question.
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think that unfortunately the reality is that psychology, social psychology is very good at averages, but it tells you basically nothing about individual human beings and individual behavior.
The ecological fallacy, basically, that you can't go from the group to the individual.
No, you can't. And actually, my graduate advisor was Walter Mischel, who studied personality, and in the 1960s wrote a book where he basically analyzed all of the data that existed up until that moment in psychology to see how predictive it was in personality psychology. If you could measure people's traits, how predictive was it of actual behavior? He found the correlation hovered around 0.2, so not very good at all. And that was at its best. Oftentimes it was 0.1. And that hasn't changed. Actually, to this day, that's actually about accurate. It's called the personality coefficient, and that's still about where we are. And so when we're talking about, oh, well, people who are extroverted tend to, be more risk-seeking. Well, sure, but maybe, I'm an extrovert who's very risk-averse in the financial domain, and maybe I love skydiving, so I'm risk-seeking in that domain. So you start seeing that people actually have behavioral signatures rather than predictable behaviors all the time. So it's kind of an if-then situation. If this happens to this person, then this is how they react. But if you're then talking about how do we use that data on a grand scale, the answer is we can't. I mean, how do you actually do that for every single individual? Big data might come into that if you have that sort of granularity of data on every single person. But do you understand how scary that is? Do you understand how much data we actually need on people's behavior across situations and across time? I mean, that terrifies me. I would much rather not have the predictive capability than to get some entity have that much insight into what I'm doing 24 hours a day.
So, Victor, on that note, there is one entity in the world that seems to be going after a whole lot of big data on a whole lot of human interactions in a whole lot of different ways, trying to build, if anybody is going to build the models that she's talking about, it's going to be the Chinese government. And I'm kind of curious, because, and this is, I guess, open to you and Bob, is the accumulation of data and the ability to monitor and process it going to give us greater predictive ability, or is it just fundamentally a fool's errand to try and chase certainty even with all the data in the world?
I was going to say that if you're looking at just the US market or just the Chinese market, those combination of data might be quite helpful. But if you look at the global market, I think it's very complicated because even if you have all the data, the Asian reaction to a particular event will be probably quite different from Europeans and Americans. So again, at the end of the day, we need a bit of luck. Vision is something that, with the benefit of hindsight, you got it right. And so at the end of the day, as Bob said, if you're a smart investor, normally you do relatively well against others. But you can't be smart all the time because that luck and the human fallibility is the uncertain equation in the formula.
Yeah.
In answer to your question, I think that big data is already starting to create a revolution in economics. Can I plug my book? I have a new book coming out called Narrative Economics, coming out in September, which is substantially a research book. As you say, we don't know how to manage all of this data, but we're learning now. We have more direct observations on what people are saying in various circumstances. We have digitized newspapers, magazines, legal cases, diaries, all sorts of things that can take us back into history and look at what people were talking about. And I think we can learn also, it's not just from the psychology department, but it's also the sociology and anthropology department. It's about changing culture, changing zeitgeist, changing our sense of what's being talked about now. And now we know. I think this economics will never be the same once we start processing the data and modeling these changes in narratives that drive our thinking.
You know, I can't believe you actually said what you just said. I agree with it, but I find it hysterical in one respect, which is it's been said that like anybody who reads a newspaper story about their own field finds all the mistakes and sees it's not particularly accurate and mischaracterized. But then when it's about some other subject they don't know, trust it, because hey, it's the New York Times, it must be obviously sort of accurate. And I got my PhD in political science and international relations, and everybody is aping the economists in political science for the last several generations. It's even hard for qualitative people or historically oriented people to get jobs. Everybody's trying to be quantified like the economists. And the idea that the economists feel they have to borrow from the sociologists and the psychologists and history and human psychology to understand more than the numbers because you can't just it's the blind talking to the blind. The people in those fields are all aping the supposed quantitative ability of that. And I look back when you talked about what you just said, the history profession fell in love with data in the 50s and 60s, and there were all these attempts to bring newfound technology. So did political science. All the various quantitative stuff and all the methodological stuff has proved not gobbledygook, but we haven't, for example, gotten past Schelling in nuclear strategy. The best work on rat choice and game theory, the von Neumann and Schelling, no one's ever progressed better than that, frankly, in my opinion. And it's not clear that we have really advanced rather than gotten different frameworks for discussing things. And that becomes the interesting question is, what frameworks and narratives do you use to discuss the various patterns that you're doing? Yes, over here.
Yes, I'd like to cast me honor and I'm from the European Commission, but I'd like to talk under my head as co-chair of the Future Council on...
Absolutely, but we'd like to get you a mic first. Hold on one second.
So I'm the co-chair of the Future Council on Information and Entertainment, and we've been looking into the way data are collected and are being read for commercial purposes and for influencing people, actually. So the work we did is that, and what we see is that a lot of data are collected without people actually being able to read them, just collect them. And I think the Chinese example is one of the, and we hope to be able to read them later. But if you look at the private sector and the way data is being used, it's really to influence people. So we're just jumping the prediction thing, we're going immediately to the influencing thing. And one of the work streams we have in our council is to develop something called the data dashboard, where people would actually find a place where they could find what data are being collected about them and would give people the idea to read themselves the data and what they are actually producing, which would add another dimension to even if myself I can read my own data, which is to push back a bit this influence on the data, which is another dimension to who reads the data and who draws what lessons from the data.
Actually, on that exact point, the broader question of the deception we were talking about, can we even rely? We've all been, even if you were to think about the numbers as being some kind of objective reality and you could predict the future from them if you built the correct models, are the numbers and the data and the input actually hard things, or are they themselves deceptive fakes? Or everyone's talking about the Chinese economic growth rates. The data on which those numbers are based. Everybody here has their own private. It'd be a great discussion to have everybody in this room say what they actually thought the Chinese growth rate was right now, because it's a situation in which sort of you feel the data is getting at something, but not exactly a complete picture of the story. So how can you? Does the inability to trust the individual components of the data, partly because it's inaccurate, partly because someone else might be trying to game you, does that make it even harder to predict anything?
Every time we download an app for free, we give away our data. But a lot of these data are accumulated in a raw sense. There's a lot of data around there, but it needs to be analyzed and put it to use. And the people analyzing, they don't know. This is me, Victor Chu. They know it is from a mobile phone, and the mobile phone number tends to suggest he's from Asia, and look at some of the things that I bought. It may be a male, maybe a particular age group, right? So you need a lot more analysis to really make the best use of it. That, I think, is the next stage. And also, how do we price this raw data is also interesting. There are stock exchanges around the world, including Singapore and Hong Kong, that's beginning to look at doing IPO on these raw data. And because there's no pricing of it. And once there's pricing of data and data become more sophisticated, then I think we have more clarity what they are making use of it. And how can we regulate and with public policy to say what are the red lines. And it'll be interesting to see how we can find out exactly what our data is being used. Because there's so, people use my data, don't know it's me right now, right? So if you want to know what your data is being used, you need to disclose that it's me, Victor Chu. And that's also another problem.
So
we're protected right now by just a number.
let me just add to that to say that from what we know, so right now psychologists are starting to look at, how reliable is data that's gathered from social media, how accurate are our portrayals of ourselves when it comes to kind of how someone who actually knows us would rate us as opposed to how someone who knows us through social media would rate us. And it ends up that the data themselves.
You mean Instagram accounts aren't accurate?
Instagram's actually 100% accurate, but otherwise, the data themselves are highly flawed. So I think that a lot of our public behaviors and a lot of the things that we do when we know we have an audience are very, very different from our private behaviors. They're different from our self-perceptions. They're different from who we are in reality. And if you're looking to influence, then you need kind of that reality, not just the perception. And the other thing that I would say is that we have to be incredibly careful to say that we even know ourselves what we want and what we're like. So there's a lot of work on the fact that oftentimes humans are the worst judges of their own motivations, of their own reasons for doing things, that we don't know why we like what we like. We don't know why we do what we do. We can't even access it ourselves. So I think right now, it's way too much of a leap to say, well, big data is going to be able to tell us more about ourselves than we actually know, because there are all these other issues that have to be solved beforehand.
Okay, turn it back to the audience. Let me just throw open one more possibility for questions or statements. Everybody here in the audience, by virtue of being in this audience, is a successful mocker, is somebody whose own ability to maneuver in the world through their ability to predict events and master things has been proven demonstrably, or else they wouldn't have gotten to the point where you're sitting in this audience. So what is it that allows you or helps you think you can actually predict and control the world? Why have you guys been successful when all the zillions of other people who would love to be in this room trying to do the same things you guys have been doing haven't been able? What are the secrets that you've had to predicting success if the Nobel Prize winning economists and the poker players and the investors can't be certain to have wonderful models? So statements about what gives you the confidence to maneuver your way through successfully would be also interesting and worthwhile. That and questions as well. Anybody here? Big room, open questions. How often do you get a chance to interview experts on Sherlock Holmes, poker, investments, and Nobel Prize winning economists? Yes, over here. People would kill for a charity auction to be in this room right now to auction these people. And you guys are here and you're not even using the opportunity. Go.
Mike Mazar from RAND. I'm not going to answer that last question because I don't consider myself an accurate predictor, but I have a question about systemic risk and an issue of perception and misperception. So it seems like when things go really wrong in terms of risk perception, we have big disasters. In part, it is sometimes because you get groups of individuals who go beyond the general human tendency not to rate risks well to sort of extreme motivated perception of risks, and they just can't see risks objectively, whether it's the financial crisis or Iraq or whatever it might be within a certain administration, a certain industry. And I wonder if any of you think that right now one of the risk factors is that we are approaching a critical mass in the international system of actors and administrations who are not reading risk objectively and whose actions will reflect a sort of super amount of bad risk perception over the next couple of years.
Anybody want to tackle that?
The big question. I just say I don't think that Donald J. Trump reads risk accurately. And making a statement, it was a year ago, that we could bomb North Korea. You don't say such things as a president of a major country. So that shows to me he has some delusions about the risks of the world we're in.
Yeah.
On that point, it's a fascinating one. I actually am less worried now about that than I was a while back, and Iraq is the perfect example, okay? The Iraq War was indeed, I think, exactly what you described, which is a bottom line, an honest mistake based on bad risk management, the 1% doctrine and various things like that. And that was able to occur not just because of bad risk management on the part of a group of people in the White House, but because of a unique set of circumstances, both American hegemony and post 9/11 domestic situations, which enabled those people's risk perceptions to get easily translated into national policy. And one of the things that happened was the screw up with that, and the screw up with the financial crisis has diversified power structures, so no individual now has the power that the George W. Bush administration had in the immediate post 9/11 environment. And so nobody could, I think, even Donald Trump, whose own risk perceptions may well be, or obviously dramatically off in a lot of respects, is checked in a lot of respect, first within his administration, then now by the Democratic Congress. And the global power that the US had is being checked. And so one of the upside potential of the sort of diversification of power and the multilateral distribution of things is that it might be a protection against the excessive craziness by one individual actor whose power is so dominant that their crazy risk perceptions can become everybody else's problems. That's what I would say to that answer. So we might actually be better off than we were in that regard now that the US is weaker and that the US presidency has less giant power. Anybody else? You had one. You each have had one. Anybody else get? You want to get somebody else first before you go back to seconds? Okay, we can go back to seconds. Here and then there. We'll bundle the two together.
In answer to your first question, I chose the career path, which was the one where you're expected to shape things, which is policy making. We try to set out strategies, and then people will follow. And there's a belief that, through elections, governments are empowered to do this. My second question to you is, what we do is model. We model ourselves to death at the moment. Should we stop modeling, and should we only observe?
Should we stop modeling and only observe? Work from the data without the models. And let's bundle that. Let's get our next question over here.
This is in response to your, so what makes you so super to be in this room? And because we're all successful people, I think we probably also all have the imposter complex fairly deeply within us. So I look at this and I say, look, if you took 1 million quarters and you flip them 1 million times, there's going to be a whole stack that came up 50 heads every single time. And are we really here because we're that good, or because we just happen to be the quarters that flipped up?
Do you
50
actually?
times?
Okay, but here's the thing. We all know that, right? But does any of the I have never met a value investor, for example, who's been successful, who's a member of the Graham and Doddsville group, and who says, yeah, I'm just the guy who basically bet heads 500 times and I got lucky, and everybody else who was betting, was wrong. No, they think they actually do it. And I'd be surprised if everybody in this room thought, yeah, I'm just here by random luck and everybody else is the real deal. Anyway, but any thoughts? Yes.
Right, to the first question about, you're inferring that what we're saying, that with big data, we might give up modeling? You're asking. I think that ultimately we have to have models, even if they're only approximate. And we have models of the spread of ideas, for example. You can't function with that in the absence of a model. And often mathematical exercises are instructive. You just have to avoid the risk that you fall in love with your models and end up playing some kind of silly game with them.
But how do you, that was a question we had earlier, which is, if your model doesn't work or has a problem and you know it, how do you say, well, I understand it doesn't work, but it's still pretty good and I'm just going to stick with it, or say, no, I'm going to change or improve it? Like, how do you know when to discard discrepant information or, and when to use it to tweak your model?
The problem is that most of us are involved in careers. So I've encountered this situation where a graduate student is finishing up his or her dissertation and then thinks, you know what? I shouldn't have done this topic. It's not going to work. But then the job market is approaching, they're finishing. They just have to run with it. And so a sort of cynicism comes in. You have to avoid, maybe you do have to run with it. Okay, you've got to watch out for yourself. But you quickly change topics as soon as you can if it doesn't feel right anybody
else have any thoughts on some of these?
Yeah, so kind of related to that, but also to your coin flip example, I think one of the most interesting findings that have come from psychology in the last 50 years, which is really relevant, is the illusion of control work that Ellen Langer did back in the 70s. And she has a paper that's called Heads I Win, Tails You Lose. And I think that that kind of encapsulates a lot of our thinking. So in this particular study, she had a random coin flip, and there were predetermined outcomes. So you were just supposed to predict heads or tails, and then you were told whether you were right or wrong. And she ended up stacking, basically lying to people in terms of the results. It was always 50-50, the same mix, but sometimes right away they would be correct a lot of the time. Other times they were wrong a lot at the beginning. And it ends up, and these were Harvard students, so she was at Harvard already at the time. So smart people, oftentimes economics students, they would actually, in the first condition where they were right a lot of the time, they'd start saying things like, I'm really good at predicting coin flips. I will get better at predicting coin flips if I have more time to practice. And they had all of these answers that showed that they actually thought that they had become very good at this thing that objectively they knew they couldn't be good at because it's a coin flip and you're predicting it. And when you hear that study, you're like, oh, how funny. You know, Harvard undergraduates are very funny people. But think about the way that you think about your stock picking abilities, about your predictive abilities, and how lucky, this goes back to your earlier point about luck, how lucky you got at different points in your career. In poker, I actually often think about how many people would have been great players, except at the beginning they ran really poorly, and they might have developed their thinking and become very successful, but they were on the wrong side of the variance at the beginning. How many others who we think of as great players are actually not that good, but got really, really lucky very early on, developed confidence, built up a bankroll, and ended up kind of sticking around over the long term. And I think you can substitute poker for investing or for any number of things to see how those sorts of biases about your own decision-making prowess are affected by environmental inputs that just had to do with randomness.
Well, it's not just what you said also. I mean, what you just said also about like the ability to have the bankroll. Yeah. I have friends who, watching other Nobel Prize winners try to engage in markets in the 90s with their various endeavors and getting their head handed to them on a plate, said that the reaction was not, don't trust Nobel Prize winners who do hedge funds, but be very, very careful about the time frame and about debt and about being on the wrong side of trades that if you're wrong, can screw you. And so in effect, managing your stash to tide through the wrong answers can be as important as that.
It's huge.
We have just a couple minutes left. Always end these things on time for good reasons. So there's a lot of great things here. I want to give our panelists an opportunity to wrap up any final thoughts they have. But let me just cycle back to one thing was said earlier about the science fiction. As I said, I do geopolitics, and we've been very bad at predicting things in my area in some respects over the last few years as well. Anybody who says they predicted Brexit and then Trump and then what Trump would play out is full of it. And yet it becomes really interesting because you can't just go, either you go home and say, I'm going to quit and leave it to somebody else to do this job because I can't do it, or you try to learn and put your stock in trade in what you're saying and what you're trying to get predictions from. And I was thinking to my staff about what science fiction could tell us about like digital stuff and cyber stuff. I was telling the young kids who didn't know these things, gee, cyberspace was a term invented by a novelist in a science fiction novel, and the laws of robotics and AI made that. And I ended up trying to tell them, and I ended up commissioning a science fiction writer named Larry Niven to actually say, what are the lessons that we've learned about the digital age and cyberspace and AI in particular, controlling AI from science fiction. If it actually works out as a piece, you'll see it in a future issue. But this notion of going to different fields for insight on what might happen, and maybe the science fiction writers who came up with 2001 and the computer you can't turn off, maybe Hal is the guy who wrote Hal can tell us something about AI in more than sort of, just our data sets. But in terms of looking forward to predict global risk going forward, what are your final thoughts for our audience with the wisdom that you have?
I would say just know that you cannot predict the future and that uncertainty is a huge factor. And be okay with that. Realize that all you can do is make the best decisions with the information you have. So try to be as objective as possible with your analysis, and be okay with being wrong and to admitting that you were wrong and that either something was flawed with your analysis or there were other factors that you didn't take into consideration. Because no matter what data we have, human beings are human. We're variable. The future is uncertain. We live in an uncertain world, and nothing we do is going to give us control of that. And I think we need to be okay with that.
Victor?
I want to make 2 points. One is, don't just look at those highlighted. Beware of those risks which are not highlighted here. Those will be coming up as a surprise. And for a value investor, those are the ones that one should look into it. A smart investor is somebody who, where luck hits you, you leverage to the full. When you don't have luck, you have staying power to survive for another day. I think that's really the best one can do.
And Bob, last word.
Okay, I would just expand our list of other disciplines to pay attention to. Neuroscience, neurolinguistics, and computer science are all advancing rapidly, and they will give us new insights into human behavior.
And with that, thank you to our panelists. Thank all of you. Have a great Davos.
Thank you.